Hello, my name is Paola Vojinovic. I'm a Renaissance art historian and I live in Florence, Italy. I wanted to thank you, first of all, for taking the time to spend this hour with me talking about one of my favorite works of art, Ginevra da Vinci. I know there is so much online content and I know your time is precious, so I'm really, really honored to be with you today. What I will do is I will share my screen so you will be able to see many of the images I've chosen for us. And then at the end, you will see my email address if you want to get in touch with me, if you want to ask me any questions. So Florence in the 15th century was probably the most interesting city in the world. It was a mix of most important families, thriving businesses, and really, really talented artists that kind of came together and with this synergy brought a new style of art that we will only in the 19th century will be called the Renaissance art, which means rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman ideals that died and were reborn in Florence in the beginning of the 15th century. I wanted to start with this slide because you get to see the image of the city of Florence. And if you look very carefully, you see the edges of what the city was. There was a wall going all the way around with different entryways to the city of Florence. And when they were building this, planning this city walls in 1310, it was a very specific time in Florentine history because the city just hit 100,000 people that lived there. And it was a really big number compared to 50,000 people that lived in Paris at the time and 30,000 living in London. So really Florence was the place to be. And when they were planning their third set of walls, the walls we see on this map, this is one of the oldest maps of the city of Florence, they were trying to kind of think of this expansion in mind and leave plenty of room for new buildings to be added on. So you see the edges of the city here that kind of remained empty. And the reason why they were not filled in with new construction is because something horrible happened in 1348. There was a bubonic plague that came to Florence in 1348, and about let's say more than half of the population died in a matter of only a few weeks. If you got the virus, you were probably gone in a matter of only just 7 days. It is estimated that the numbers of the citizens in the world came back to the numbers pre-bubonic plague only in the 17th century. So the whole world was devastated by it. The Florence in the 15th century will be Florence of the Medici family. And here we get to see Lorenzo the Magnificent de Medici, who was the Medici ruler at the time when Leonardo da Vinci was a young man. Medici were the banking family of the city, and they had this really important fine line to walk in Venice because they couldn't really be named de facto rulers of the city, but they would be referred to as one of the many, so one of first of among the equals, let's say. And Lorenzo the Magnificent especially had this fascinating court around him. There's a beautiful fresco by Domenico Ghirlandaio in Santa Maria Novella Church. And here we get to see the men on the lower left. There are 4 men. They are actually philosophers at Lorenzo's court. And in the writings of the time, we see that there was never really a competition between these men. It seems that they all had a place to collaborate together. And I love how they're represented kind of on the corner of the society, looking in, commenting on what is happening in Florence at the time. And here's a little detail that shows us the details of them. Marsilio Ficino, the one on the far left, was a very, very good friend of Ginevra's father. So we will get to see the Benci family and how prominent they were in the city. But let's talk about Leonardo. This is presumed by many that this was Leonardo's self-portrait, but it wasn't. It was probably just an old man Leonardo wanted to paint. And I wanted to think of Leonardo at this time in Lorenzo's court. There are all these educated men, and I kind of wanted to think of the young Leonardo and ask the question: did he fit in the Florentine society, or was he a little bit of an outsider? Leonardo was born in 1452 in a small area close to Florence called Benci. It's about 45 kilometers from the city. And Leonardo descended from the family where all of the men were notaries, starting with mid 14th century, except in two instances. His grandfather, Antonio, wasn't a notary, and then also Leonardo himself decides to pursue a very different career. Leonardo was born out of wedlock. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, never married his mother. And curiously, he even took a very active part of finding her a suitable husband after she gave a birth to their child, which Ser Piero then acknowledged and gave him his name. Interestingly enough, also, Piero married 4 times, which even for Renaissance was 2 times too many. And I kind of see Leonardo as someone who was left to his own devices and left to really fill his days with his own imagination and wanderings. He probably taught himself how to read and write. And also, he probably learned Latin much later on in life, which is not really fitting for a Florentine man, because young Florentine men of a patrician class would probably grow up speaking Latin and Greek at the same time. We have one description of Leonardo by a writer known as Anonimo Magliabecchiano, and he writes in the 16th century. He was a beautiful person, well-proportioned, agreeable, and lovely to look at. He wore a short, rose-colored tunic reaching down to his knees, at a time when long clothes were being worn. A fine beard, well arranged in ringlets, descended to the middle of his chest. I wanted to just look through Leonardo's notebooks. Leonardo used to say that you should always have a piece of paper and a pen in your pocket to record the life around you, to record your thoughts and ideas you might have. And he really took this seriously. There is literally tens of thousands of pages of his notebooks. And they kind of shows the varied interest that the artist had. The notes you see scribbled on the side sometimes go off in a completely different direction to what is portrayed, kind of showing us just how busy his mind was. There are just so many wonderful examples of his musings. Anatomy studies, botanical studies. We will also see that he was obsessed with white birds, but also water, the power of water. And record this one because we will get to see this later on with Ginevra's painting. My favorite question that I found in Leonardo's notebooks is he asks and he wonders about the color of the water on the moon. So I think it's just fascinating that his questions didn't really just stop, with our own planet, but he looked at the world beyond and was wondering about that as well. Here we get to see the Banshee Palace. The house of the Benci family is now on the street called Via dei Benci. They purchased probably 2 family palazzi to then unite them into one. And the Benci home is very close to Palazzo Gondi, which used to be Leonardo's own home as well. So they're about 5-minute distance. And we know that there was a kind of important link between the 2 families. It is probably Leonardo's father, Ser Piero da Vinci, who secured this first commission for Leonardo, because we know that he was a notary for the Banshee family on several occasions. And at the time, Leonardo, who is about 20 years old, is still working in the studio of his Florentine teacher, Verrocchio. In addition, Leonardo also was a very, very good friend of Ginevra's oldest brother, Giovanni. And maybe kind of a credit to that is also the fact that when Leonardo leaves Florence to go to Milan, he leaves his Adoration of the Magi, uncompleted painting, in the possession of Giovanni. He leaves it in Giovanni's palace, thinking that one day he will come back to finish it, but he never did. The painting is now in the same condition in the Uffizi Gallery of Florence. I wanted to just show you this man on the far right. Some scholars believe this is Leonardo's own portrait, because this would be the typical place where the artist would kind of leave their own selfie. And he's not looking at us, but he's actually looking at the side to kind of telling us, oh, what else is coming on? What other commissions are coming my way? And let's just compare that very quickly with a painting with the same subject, Adoration, by Botticelli. And we see Botticelli's own portrait at the far right as well, and they're two contemporaries. I also just want to show you this painting of the Annunciation, also in Uffizi, because this is showing us a work of art that was pretty much done at the same time when Leonardo is working on Ginevra dei Benci. So there she is. There is few questions about the date of this painting. Accepted date for the portrait is 1474, because this was the moment when we know that Ginevra gets engaged to Luigi Niccolini, and they get married on the 15th of January of 1474. So this is accepted time of the dating of the painting, because usually the portraits of young women would be done the time when they would be either engaged, leaving their house for the new household, or at the time of the wedding. But we will see this later on. We will talk about this, that maybe the dating is a little bit later on, but we will get to it. It is one of my favorite paintings by Leonardo da Vinci, because it is not only his first emblematic portrait, but with Ginevra, he was able to create something that we will call a psychological portrait. And we will get to see all the details of it in this hour together. Most women at the time would marry not for love, but it would be really a business contract. It would be something negotiated by the male members of their family. In case of Ginevra, whose father dies in 1438, it was probably her brother Giovanni that made all the arrangements. Niccolini at the time was 16 years her senior. So he was already a widower, and he was 32 years old. Ginevra's dowry was a staggering 1,400 gold florins, which is a really big amount. One gold florin could buy you 30 chickens at the time. So she really brings him a huge dowry. And the question of dowries will be something, really important in Renaissance. It would provide liquid assets for these new husbands, as we see from this quote written by Gregorio Dati. And Gregorio married 4 times in his lifetime. Most of his wives died in childbirth, and he always is opening new businesses, looking for new ventures. So he says he needs money to come in, and he says, the rest I expect to obtain if I marry again this year, when I hope to find a woman with a dowry as large as God may be pleased to grant me. If I do not marry, I will find the money some other way. I want to just share with you how women would be portrayed before Leonardo comes on the stage. And one of the busiest studios in Florence would have been these 2 brothers, Antonio and Piero del Pollaiuolo. And there are hundreds of these beautiful paintings of women scattered around museums in the world. And we see the typical representation of a woman at the time. They will be probably young teens, already promised in marriage, and we get to see beautiful clothes. This is kind of the hallmark of Florentine textile industry. Very beautiful jewels as well. And women always represented strictly in profile with these very nondescript backgrounds. The tradition of portraying men was almost the same, as you get to see here, portrait of a man with a glove, where he's not really profile, but he is a little bit more active. But it will be Leonardo who will bring something very, very new in. I also wanted to show you this beautiful portrait by Ghirlandaio Giovanna Tornabuoni. And this was unfortunately the portrait done after she died. She had a second baby and she died in childbirth. The baby was stillborn, and her husband, Lorenzo Tornabuoni, commissioned this work of art in her memory. So look at the date, 1488. This will be much later after Leonardo's Ginevra was painted, but the tradition of these very serious portraits in Renaissance with women who are not interacting with us at all, really displaying the wealth and the power of their husband's family, still lives on. And I just love the letter L that is inscribed on her dress. So even the beautiful brocade that she's wearing kind of links her to the husband, so again, to his family. So there she is. Ginevra is looking melancholy, kind of looking past by us. She looks pale and she stares past by us with this sulkiness, but this melancholy beauty about her. She is depicted seated upright with her head turned slightly towards us. And her unusually broad face is framed by the beautiful curls that are parted in the middle and then secured in the back with a bonnet. She's wearing a brown dress with elegant details. You get to see the beautiful blue ribbon, but also the gold trim of the dress itself. And this sheer white blouse held by just this one single gold button at her chest. The black scarf that she's wearing was interpreted by some of the art historians as a fashionable item at the time, but we will come back to this clothing, this item of clothing later on. The modeling of Ginevra's face is exceptional and corresponds to Leonardo's instruction. See that your shadows and lights blend like smoke without strokes or borders. The shadows are edgeless and the entire face is extremely delicate. She has a porcelain white complexion, rose cheeks, and her lips are drawn together in this quiet line. Notice that he's able to draw her lips without using any lines, but he's actually using this almost imperceptible shift of color from ivory to pale rose. Her eyes are probably the most interesting feature of this portrait, and her gaze looks distracted and almost indifferent, almost as she's looking through us. And then notice this really unruly bush behind her hair. This is a juniper bush, in Italian, Ginepro. So in a very beautiful way, Leonardo is actually showing us the name of the sitter, Ginepro for Ginevra. There's also virtual signature in the curls that Leonardo paints for her, which are very similar to the swirling forms that he uses for water. So this curvy pattern they share shows us the curls of the hair, but also the swirls of the water as these interrelated parts of nature. Ginevra is depicted outdoors, and in his notebooks, as a very young man, Leonardo said that each ideal painting should have a beautiful body of water and a distant background that would give the painting an infinite feel. And we get to see this in every painting Leonardo does, even in his Mona Lisa later on. So this still water kind of reflects and gives like a light to the sitter as well. With the background, we also see the beginning of Leonardo's sfumato technique. So things get to be fumo in Italian is smoky or hazy. So this smoky and hazy effect will be really one of Leonardo's signatures. The back of the portrait is painted to imitate a rare red porphyry. And we see an emblem, a branch of juniper surrounded with a laurel on the left and then the palm tree on the right. And then there's this insignia or personal inscription that says in Latin, Virtutem forma decorat, which translates to beauty adorns virtue. Ginevra was a poet adorned for her beauty. And so on the front of the painting, you get to see her face, but on the back of it, we see her inner character. And we have this emblematic portrait where all the symbols are carefully chosen to communicate a very clear message. I want to just show you the laurel leaf would be something that was always associated with poets. So here is a etching of Ovid, one of the Roman poets from the 1st century AD. But really the laurel leaves goes back even to a Greek antiquity. Then I want to just show you this poet of poets, Florentine Dante Alighieri. This was his posthumous portrait by Botticelli, and he always has the laurel leaves. But this tradition lives on in Italy even today. If you graduate from an Italian university, you become laureato. And laurea is the day of the graduation, where you're given this laurel leaf crown, and the students get to wear it for a whole day. The tradition of this beautiful laurel crown given to the graduates started at the University of Padua. The Padua University is the oldest university in the world, but then tradition kind of continues on to all of the Italian universities, even to our modern days today. And then we have in the middle the Juniper Bush. This refers to chastity, probably the most valued quality for a Renaissance woman. And then we have the palm trees, which are usually something that would be represented with the early Christian martyrs for their strong moral values. Interestingly enough, the back of the painting links Ginevra not to her husband, but to another man. His name was Bernardo Bamba, and he was a Venetian patrician who was an ambassador for the city of Florence, for the city of Venice, sent to Florence on 2 different occasions. The first time from 1475 to 76, and then later on he came back again in 79 to 80. At the time when he arrived to Florence, Bernardo Bamba was 42 years old. He already had a wife and a mistress. But it seems that when he met Ginevra at a private party, he fell in love with her. And there was this incredible affair between them that some sources describe as purely platonic. Other sources speak about an adulterous affair. And Bembo, which was kind of the fashion of the time, commissioned artists and philosophers to write poems about this platonic love. And this would be something that would be like a fashion at the Medici court, where all the Medici brothers, Giuliano and Lorenzo, had their own platonic lovers. So Bembo comes right in and fits right in with this new fashion. So we know that he commissions 10 poems to celebrate his love to Ginevra, and one of them survives still. It was really interesting. It says, "It is with these flames, and which with such a love that Bembo is on fire and burns, and Ginevra dwells in the midst of his heart." This was written by Cristoforo Landino. Many years later, when he returned to Venice, Bernardo Bembo wrote different notes on the margins of the books he had, and in some of them, he refers to Ginevra as the most beautiful woman in Florence. So some scholars believe it was Bernardo Bembo that actually commissioned this painting. It would be very unusual, probably the first time in Renaissance we have a lover that would commission a work of art. But there are 3 really strong reasons that might point us to Bembo. The first one is just the way Ginevra is dressed. Her simple attire doesn't really fit in with this ideal of a wedding portrait. And here you have the really nice comparison to what Joanna would have looked like. So this really simple everyday dress kind of points that this might be a portrait done for different reasons. The other link with Bembo is this Latin insignia on the back, Virtutem Forma Decorat, which is really similar to Bembo's own, virtue and honor. So it seems that he would have been one that would suggest to Leonardo to include this on the back to give us a little bit more of a Ginevra's character and help us to understand the sitter a little bit more. And finally, probably this is the strongest point towards Bernardo Bembo as a commissioner, is this portrait by Hans Memling, portrait of a man with a Roman coin. Hans Memling was a German artist who lived in Bruges, and he was active in Bruges, and he was the one that will start with this really active way of presenting the sitter. And then he also introduces the landscapes in the back. So you kind of see this really beautiful combination of the style and composition that Memling did and then Leonardo took on. We know that Bembo had this painting in his collection. Some scholars even believe that this could have been Bembo's own portrait. In any case, for sure, Leonardo was able to see it and then probably borrow from the Northern European artists. In any case, though, if we look at these two paintings together, we see that Leonardo was able to portray Ginevra not as a young woman, young bride, but she's portrayed as Bembo's equal in all the effects. And this kind of composition with three-quarter sitter turned towards us and interacting with us, this will be the first example for either sex in the Italian art. So I think it's interesting that this steady reserve that Ginevra shows here is something that we will get to see for the first time in the Italian portraiture. Now, the provenance of this painting is kind of interesting. And the question is, what happens to the painting after it was completed, and who has it in their home? There are three earliest Leonardo's biographers who write about this painting. They describe it in great detail, but they actually never tell us where they saw it. One thing is for sure, Luigi Niccolini is never referred to as the owner of the painting. So it seems that it was never in his own home. The only reference we have to the painting actually goes to the 18th century. In 1733, it is said that the painting was at the court of the Prince of Liechtenstein. And the reason for this is there is this beautiful red seal in the upper right that has the date and the coat of arms of the Liechtenstein house. And so we know for sure that in the 18th century, the painting was in their possession. What happened to it before is unsure. I believe the painting might have been taken to Venice by Bernardo Bembo. And the reason for this is this inscription. It says, if the poet says that he can inflame men with love, the painter has the power to do the same, in that he can place in front of the lover the true likeness of one who is beloved, often making him kiss and speak to it. This is Leonardo's own words. So Bernardo Bembo would be the one, if he loved her so much, he would be the one who would have taken the painting with him. The reason also why I think it was in Venice is because from Venice it was probably easier for us to end up in Liechtenstein. But in Liechtenstein, in the catalog from the 18th century, they refer to this painting as something that was done by Lucas Cranach. So they didn't even know it was Leonardo's work. I believe the painting was purchased by the prince's family. For sure in Florence, they would have known the painting was done by Leonardo because he was such a celebrated artist in the city. In 1967, the painting was purchased by Elsa Mellon for $5 million. And this was a huge amount of money at the time. It will be equivalent to $100 million today. When the Prince of Liechtenstein announced that the painting was for sale, there was a really fierce competition for it. But the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. really wanted to have this only one Leonardo in the US. And the reason maybe why they also wanted it is because a few years later, earlier in 1963, they had Mona Lisa on loan, the age of Kennedy, and the Mona Lisa was there for 27 days, and 1 million people, actually no, 500,000 people came to see her. So the National Gallery Board of Trustees knew if they had this, they would have this really beautiful painting, which is visited today by scholars, but also by visitors. Probably one of the favorites in their collection. Sometimes in its long life, the painting's dimension changed. Probably about 1/3 was cut off from the bottom. Probably there was a damage either with water or fire, and it was necessary to chop it off. So if you look at the painting now, you see how harshly her face looks right in the middle. It looks almost like a big white moon. And but probably this is how she looked like when Leonardo painted her. This reconstruction shows us that it was much more harmonious, much more in the style of Renaissance. And her features are now much more delicate. So what was cut off is probably these beautiful white hands that the writers of the period described as gracious hands with ivory white fingers. There is one beautiful drawing in the Windsor Castle that shows us the study of hands by Leonardo. And this could have been his study for Ginevra. He would be always studying beforehand. And if this is true, then this drawing links us to the work of Verrocchio, who was Leonardo's teacher. And you see this beautiful bust of a woman preserved in Bargello Museum today. And you see the same style, the hair parted in the middle, the curls, even the lips look very similar. And then also the see-through white shirt is even beautifully visible in marble, and then the beautiful delicate hands. So this is interesting to link us to Leonardo's teacher Verrocchio, because poor Verrocchio never gets enough credit. Leonardo always borrows from him. He's always looking up at his teacher, and a good example of that is in his early work in Uffizi, the Annunciation. There is this beautiful reading stand of the Madonna with all these really fancy details. Then you see what Leonardo is actually looking at. He's looking at the sarcophagus made by Verrocchio for the father of Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici, Piero de' Gauti. So the connections between Leonardo and Verrocchio are numerous, especially at the beginning of his career. This portrait is among Leonardo's earliest experiments with the oil medium. And it seems that Leonardo is the first person to actually teach himself how to use oil. And a little bit of this, the wrinkling on the surface of this painting shows us that he's still learning how to control and use this new medium. So how would he paint? He would first blend thin layers of paint over with a brush, and then he would manipulate the surface with either his fingers or the palm of his hand to kind of create this soft focused effect. And he might have been the first artist to do this. Especially in Florence, this would be something unusual because the Florentine School of Art would always encourage their artists to use lines. So the line is the most important kind of part of the Florentine School of Art. Also notice how Leonardo uses texture to show us different areas of the painting. So beautiful soft curls of Ginevra in very sharp contrast with that kind of spiky, prickly bush of juniper behind her hair. And to get this effect of the beautiful curls, almost painted like one by one, Leonardo probably used the end of his brush. So he's definitely experimenting on so many levels when he does this. Just take a look at the dress for a moment. I think maybe the dress is the only part where we get to see a really young artist because it looks very wooden, almost like her body is not really underneath. So, there's a man who is just trying to figure things out. He's only about 19, 20 years old when he does this. Leonardo experimented a lot with different mediums during his lifetime. We know that when he paints the Last Supper in Milan, one of his most celebrated works of art, that fresco was starting to deteriorate even while Leonardo was still alive. So we have the Grand Duke of Milan writing to Leonardo in Paris, and he asks him if he can come back to fix up the fresco a little bit. So this experimentation with the pigments and the color and medium is why I think museums that own Leonardo's paintings are very afraid to touch them and to clean them. For example, the Louvre, his Mona Lisa, she should be cleaned, but they're very hesitant to do that. We know that in the 16th century, for the first time, that they restored a painting with just one wipe of the cloth, her eyebrows were all erased. So anyway, the painting is in a very, very good condition. When it was brought in from the Liechtenstein's collection, they said there was no need to restore it. And the first restoration actually happened in 1991 when the series of different kind of lights and different strong photography with strong lights was taken. Uh, and it showed us that there is a few of Leonardo's fingerprints all over the painting, which is kind of neat. I think every Leonardo's painting has at least one of his fingerprints somewhere. In case of this portrait, it's probably to the right of her chin and also kind of behind her shoulder, somewhere here, which we had it. The radiography also showed that this blue ribbon had to be repainted because it was probably damaged during that fire. So this was something that was added on. And it also showed the difference in color and what kind of happened with, especially with the green. The choice of green was limited for the Renaissance artists. They would use copper-based color that would darken over time. Only in a matter of a few years, it would, in contact with light, it would change. And you see that here in detail, the juniper bush. You see how it kind of became brown, but then also the yellowish part goes all the way around on the blue as well. So this is something that cannot be reversed. It cannot be restored back to its previous splendor. Another detail here, look at her eye, and you get to see that the white in her eye is the same color like her skin. So this was probably a different shade of white at the time, but it got kind of darkened over time. And then last discovery, when they looked at the painting under the, I think it was infrared lighting, they found that the motto of Bamba, virtue and honor, was actually inscribed underneath. So we have one more link to her Venetian lover. I love to compare these two ladies, to see them on the same screen, and it's really a pleasure to see two paintings that Leonardo did in a 40-year span. And they have a lot in common. They're both young second wives of the Florentine cloth merchants. They're both represented in three-quarters pose. They also both have this beautiful landscape and the water behind them. So they're set against a river landscape. And although Ginevra is an immature portrait compared to Mona Lisa, the directness of manner and impact of personality, so powerfully indicated by Leonardo, with his work, shows us that he, even though he's a young artist, he's able to lend this psychological quality to Ginevra, something unheard of, unseen of before he came on. And this psychological quality will become the hallmark of the modern day portraiture. Also, Leonardo was able to transform what was the standard traditional portrait of a woman with the rich garments and beautiful jewels, but really kind of showing the power of her husband or the family that she married into. He was able to kind of leave all that aside, and with these two women that are so simply dressed, he's able to have us focus on so many nuances of their personality. So we kind of get just a glimpse of who they were as people. I think this comparison also shows the development of Leonardo in those 40 years and how he became a mature artist, but not only a painter, but also a philosopher and a scientist and a humanist. But the seeds of all that we get to see in Mona Lisa were already planted in his Ginevra, which I think is just extraordinary. And this new naturalism that he introduces with Ginevra will be that will transform the Renaissance painting from that point on. And this will be his greatest artistic achievement. I often wonder what kind of life Ginevra had. How was she able to navigate the Florentine society as a young woman belonging to this important, wealthy family? Her family were the bankers for the Medici family. But also she was a poet with a classical education. So what kind of life she would have lived? Although she was praised for her beauty, I think Ginevra's life was not really that happy. She married very young. She married a man that she probably didn't love. She probably had a deep love and affection for Bernardo Bamba, who left Florence in 1480, never to come back again. Later on in her life, Ginevra experienced an illness and she remained childless. We have little glimpses of Ginevra's life that come from different sources in Florence, and one of them is a tax return filled by her husband, Luigi Niccolini, in 1480. And his family was in claw to weaving business. So although Niccolini was really politically a prominent individual, he was not as wealthy as Ginevra would have been. And in this tax return, he declares that he has more debts than property, and that his wife was ill and had been, quote, in the hands of doctors for a long time, end quote. So I think these few lines in the tax return correspond to the general feeling of Leonardo's portrait. Leonardo said that the face should express a state of mind. And I wanted us just to focus on Ginevra's eyes, probably the most haunting part of this painting, these almond eyes. And he's able to lend this psychological presence. He creates a psychological portrait, a portrait that renders hidden emotions. And you can wonder, how does he do that? If you look carefully at her eyes, notice the shiny liquid quality that Leonardo is able to achieve with his oils. To the right of each pupil is a tiny spot of luster. This perfect glint of luster, almost like a white sparkle, caused by light hitting a soft and shiny surface, is something that would become like Leonardo's signature. And all the really good portraits will have that. Almost these little tiny pieces of light in her eyes are giving her this inner life, almost like her soul is visible. And all the good portraits will have that. So what appears at first as this vacant face and a distant stare is actually infused with this haunting tinge of emotion. And we get to see this inner intensity in Ginevra that we don't get to see in portraits that date from the same time. I think she has almost this magnetic spell about her. Interestingly enough, we get another glimpse of Ginevra's life from a letter of a man that will remain anonymous because he was Ginevra's friend, probably a Florentine living and working in Rome, who writes to Ginevra and he signs his letter with only two initials, G and H. And in this letter, he compliments Ginevra on the birth of a child of Ginevra's sister. So Ginevra is a new aunt, and this man writes, "The same thing should your magnificence do, who from excessive haughtiness refuses to present us mortals with her descendants. Well, have it your way. So we know that Ginevra actually had a choice, probably to have children, but it seems that she refused to have them. And in 1490, she would have been about 32 years old. The letter also gives us this beautiful gift as well, because the man who writes tells Ginevra that he had lost the poem that she had sent him, which he apparently really loved. And he says, Ginevra, would you please send me again the copy of that poem, that the one that starts with, I beg your pardon, I'm a mountain tiger. So with this anonymous letter actually gives us this beautiful gift of destiny. We get to see only a few lines that survive of Ginevra's poetry. And what powerful lines they are. There's almost this contradiction that we get to see in the portrait as well. A mountain tiger that begs someone's pardon is something unheard of. So I think this inner intensity is really shown in her words, but also in the portrait by Leonardo. So that we had this really a long time that we spent in Ginevra's company. Let's take a look at her again. And I think this inner intensity is obviously clearly visible, melancholy, also melancholy beauty. And I believe that the painting was done a little bit later on, not for her wedding, because Ginevra doesn't look like she's 16 years old here. She's probably in her early 20s. She could be maybe 23 in 1480 when Bernardo Bamba left Florence. We know that Ginevra was heartbroken. And there are different poets at the court who write about this, and they said Ginevra suffered from dolce pazzia, that she had this crazy, kind of sweet craziness after he left, that she kind of almost goes crazy. So what we might be seeing in this portrait is a woman who was heartbroken and who kind of knows that the man she really loves will never come back to Florence again. And the black scarf that is around her neck might also give us a little hint of what happens to her life after 20, let's say 1480s, after Bernardo Bembo is gone. Ginevra might have become involved with the Le Murate convent in Florence. This was a female nunnery. The women there lived in clausura, meaning they were locked off from the outside world. And Ginevra had strong family links to Le Murate because it was her grandfather who established the convent in the first place, and her grandfather and her father were both buried there. There's some indication that Ginevra might be buried there as well. So it's very possible that Ginevra kind of is involved with this convent again, and this black scarf around her shoulders might be linking her to that order. Usually the nuns would wear a very long black kind of scarf that goes all the way down to their probably their feet. But in case of a tertiary nun, those that had freedom to kind of come and go, they could have a very kind of a shorter scarf that we still associate them with that order. So that might be kind of also why she chose this very specific piece of clothing that was done. I wanted to show you also one more thing that links Ginevra to Lorenzo the Magnificent. And Lorenzo writes two poems dedicated to her, but one of them starts with, I am that sheep that his pastor has lost. So this kind of religious note that Lorenzo indicates might be that Ginevra was lost, but then she's found again with her commitment to the convent, with her kind of going back to being a sheep of God. So that might be also another explanation with the poetry. I wanted to end this presentation with the text written by John Walker, who was the second director of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure he had a lot of time with Ginevra in private. So he writes, Luigi, Carlo, and Giovanni, Tita, and Lucrezia all have vanished. Their names survive and a few records of their activities, but their personalities are gone. Only Ginevra remains. She lives almost as vividly for us as she once lived for her Bernardo Bamba and Luigi Niccolini. Leonardo da Vinci has given her immortality. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to stay with me and to examine this extraordinary work of art. I'm proud to share with you my upcoming Renaissance Art History Masterclass. The class will start on the 20th of May, 2020, and we will meet on Wednesdays for 10 weeks. So 20th of May all the way to 22nd of July at 11 o'clock on the West Coast, which will be 2 p.m. on the East Coast. And I really hope you will join me for this masterclass. If you have any questions, if you want to follow me on the social media, I'm Paula50122 on Instagram and then Paula Vojnovic on Twitter. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write me at paula50122 at gmail.com. Grazie.